You hear a whimper coming from off the trail. Moving through the underbrush to investigate, you see a small reptilian creature covered in blood trying to crawl its way towards you. Rushing forward to help, you fail to see the snare. It catches your ankle, spinning you upside down in an instant. You slam your head into the ground before being yanked into the air by a cleverly hidden counterweight. The woods erupt into a cacophony of yips, and through blurry eyes, you see the wounded creature stand and flash a wicked grin of sharp teeth. As your head clears, you realize you walked right into a kobold ambush. Hello Internet, I'm Steven. Today I'd like to discuss some monster tactics. I'm going to be doing more of these videos where I look at the mechanical side of monsters and give some tips on how to run them, specifically in combat. I don't think I'll be delving too deep into the lore of each monster because lore can vary wildly by campaign setting. However, many monsters have a foundational theme that stays constant no matter the setting, so I'll try to use that as a starting point. Today's video is specifically about the kobold. If you've ever played a low-level campaign with me, you've probably fought against kobolds. They're one of my favorite low-level threats because they challenge a party's tactics and strategy instead of their mechanical abilities. When used correctly, kobolds are an excellent tool to teach your party how to work together and develop team tactics. Before we dig too deep, we need to think about what drives the kobold.
You're just gonna have to figure out what it wants. What is its motivation?
Kobolds have one basic desire, which is group survival. There's an important distinction between group survival and individual survival. Kobolds can be fanatical, and they will die for their tribe without hesitation if it means that the tribe will survive. But that also means that they won't throw away their lives recklessly, as that would hurt their tribe in the long run. I don't like to run kobolds as cowardly. I prefer to think of them as pragmatic. They will avoid conflict unless it benefits their tribe, and they will end a conflict early if it's a losing fight. It's important to think about why the kobolds would initiate a fight, because that will in turn decide how the kobolds respond in the middle of combat. An encounter with kobolds should never be to the last man. Kobolds have very specific goals, and a glorious death is not one of them. The most common and basic reason for a kobold ambush is that they want loot, just like your players. A kobold tribe is constantly growing, and they need resources to sustain that. This means if kobolds are winning the fight against your party, the kobolds probably won't bother finishing your players off, especially if it means risking more kobold lives. Instead, they would offer a parley or maybe a truce, saying that the party can leave, but the gold stays. Kobolds are clever, but they are not prudent. They don't think about the long term, where your party will hold a grudge against them. Kobolds are also obsessed with magical items, meaning that they could ambush a party simply because they caught a glimpse of the wizard's spellbook. In this example, they would focus fire the entire fight on the wizard, and then when he falls, they would take the book and hightail it out of there. Kobolds don't bother trying to get a TPK or total party kill, because it doesn't help their end goals. Every kobold casualty hurts the future of the tribe. Now that we know kobolds prefer to avoid a fight, what's more important is when they do initiate combat, the odds are heavily stacked against your players. A kobold ambush always happens in a location of their choice. They never attack a camp or an established settlement. Instead, they would try to lure the party into a nearby location that already has traps prepared. Kobolds are very fond of waylaying travelers on secluded roads because they have time to prepare their ambush. This also reflects a kobold's tactics during the encounter. Kobolds want the adventurers to close into melee range, but first they try to force the adventurers to fight through a storm of arrows and bolts while triggering trap and trap along the way. And once the group is bloodied, the kobolds descend upon their victims with a vicious ferocity. Remember, kobolds have an ability called pack tactics, which gives them advantage on attacks when an ally is nearby. Abuse this ability. Kobolds will only engage in melee combat with 4-to-1 odds or better. If you have 10 kobolds, don't split them up. Instead, imagine your little fiends as a swarm, devouring everything in its path before moving on to the next victim. And don't forget that pack tactics also gives kobold advantage on ranged attacks. Their ally must be within 5 feet, but the attacker can be at any distance. So with our group of 10 kobolds, you can have 4 or 5 of them in melee range of a player, and the rest of the swarm is throwing everything but the kitchen sink at their victim. Kobolds are aware enough to know when they are losing a fight, and this is important, because like we talked about earlier, kobolds don't fight to the last man. When kobolds lose, say, 30% of their group, they flee. And if they can't flee, they surrender and try to escape later on. It's good to make a note of that magic number before the combat begins. For instance, if you have an encounter with 10 kobolds, and 3 of them die, the rest of the pack will begin a fighting retreat. Players rarely allow an enemy to retreat. They hate it. So be sure that your players pay the price to push forward. Just like how kobolds always have a plan of attack, they also always have a plan of retreat. Any prepared kobolds will have traps laid out to discourage pursuers. Occasionally, your players will decide not to push their advantage because you focused your attacks on a single character, meaning that the players instead need to worry about healing. And this is where the really fun part begins. A kobold retreat does not mean that the encounter is over. Players are conditioned to think that when the miniatures leave the map, they won't come back. Now we're going to teach them a very valuable lesson. If kobolds still have numbers on their side, which they should because they retreated after about 30% casualties, then the kobolds will double back and attack again while the party is licking their wounds. If a character was already hurting, guess who the first target's going to be? During this second encounter, the kobolds will retreat as soon as they become outnumbered, and this time for good. But don't forget to keep using those traps and hazards during the second fight. Kobolds are known for being extremely clever, and that should extend beyond the traps they use. In my games, kobolds often fight with a poisoned or a diseased weapon. Get your players rolling those con saves. I actually really like the poison condition in 5th edition, because players get a minor debuff, but it isn't deadly and it doesn't affect their hit points, and it prevents that death spiral that other conditions can cause. It's an easy way for a DM to up the tension without skewing the difficulty too much. Kobolds also love mounts. It works thematically, and it also gives the group a bit of variety and extra punch. Depending on what challenge rating you need, I would recommend going with either giant weasels or with wolves. And remember that mounts count as allies for pack tactics, and wolves actually have pack tactics as well, so there's a lot of synergy there. This is also the perfect chance to break out a very underused weapon, the net. Nets don't offer much of a threat at higher levels, so abuse them here at lower levels. It won't take much for a player to get free, but that's okay. Nets are meant to take a monster's action and swap it for a player's action. And 10 kobolds have a lot more actions than 4 or 5 players. If you do have Volo's Guide to Monsters, there is a kobold inventor with a list of like 8 makeshift weapons that are fantastic inspiration. I love it. In my games, I don't actually bother with the inventor's stat block though, and I just give crazy thrown weapons to every kobold. I like each kobold to have 1 or 2 grenades that are one and done. It's important to remember that monsters can have consumables just like the players do. One of my favorite moments as a DM are when my kobolds chuck a clay jar at the player. And the pot breaks easily, it does maybe 2 points of damage, but it leaves the player with a much more pressing concern. You are now covered in a mass of scorpions and spiders, each one stinging and clawing at you as they crawl across your face and into the crevices of your armor. Make a con save versus poison. Kobolds should always be in charge of how the battle flows. If the players let their fighter charge forward to tank, while the rest of the party hangs back to use ranged attacks, then have the kobolds throw a few smoke bombs. Now the fighter is alone and starting to be a little worried. I'm a bit of a lazy DM, so I don't worry about deciding what each individual kobold has equipped before the encounter. Just have a small list prepared of the weapons you'd like to use, and remember that each kobold only has 1 or 2 thrown weapons, depending on the difficulty you'd like the encounter to be. You can then react appropriately to the ebb and flow of combat, giving your little critters the right tool for the right situation. This also will allow your kobolds to appear much more effective and make you look much more devious as a DM, which admittedly is a hard illusion to maintain when you're running a fight with over a dozen combatants. Now we should talk a little bit about kobold spellcasters. Kobolds rarely use divine magic because healing doesn't matter when you only have 5 hit points. Instead, focus on making sure your kobolds don't take damage in the first place. Use arcane magic to control the battlefield, making it hard for players to move into proper positioning, or separating the party and giving your little guys some much-needed cover. I won't go into too much detail on how to tactically play a spellcaster, because there's way too many variables and it really deserves its own video. Instead, I'll just mention a few spells that I think kobolds can make solid use of. Minor Illusion, I believe, is the best cantrip in the game for both players and monsters. Kobolds especially find it useful to hide their traps before the adventurers even arrive. Alternatively, it can be used to create images of pits and barriers and funnel players into better positioning or into real traps, and it allows the kobolds to control the battlefield even more. This cantrip really is only limited by your imagination. 2 more fun cantrips are Control Flames and Create Bonfire. Used together, your kobold sorcerer can create a rudimentary wall of fire for your party to contend with. Bear in mind that while this has some really fun symmetry, your sorcerer does have to survive long enough to cast both spells. Fog Cloud is another great spell for the same reason as smoke bombs. Splitting the party and obscuring ranged combatants can be incredibly useful in combat, especially when one hit kills a kobold. If you're a fan of the grenades and consumables that I was talking about earlier, give your sorcerer a big bag of toys along with the catapult spell, and your spellcaster is now a magical cannon. A well-placed sleep spell can be devastating to your players at low levels, but it loses most of its effectiveness when players reach about level 3. This is also a good time to note that sleep can be equally devastating to your own kobolds, so watch out for players with it in their spell list. If one of your players does have the spell, make sure that they work to get good placement, don't just leave your kobolds in a giant clump. Now, I do understand that a lot of these suggestions can really screw up the challenge rating for our humble little kobold, and that's okay. You are the one in control of how the encounter plays out, so remember the kobold's goal. Kobold encounters should always end early because neither side wants to fight to the death. Kobolds are pragmatic. In a losing fight, they retreat as soon as they realize things are going south, and when kobolds are winning, they will tell the players to retreat. Just have them rob the party and move on, and the players will want to hunt down the kobolds to regain their loot and their dignity. The campaign will happily continue despite the fact that you just threw an accidentally overpowered encounter against your players. If your players do decide they want to fight to the death, which unfortunately they almost always do, you can use non-lethal force to subdue them. Kobolds don't care about revenge, and they don't have the same bloodlust that other monsters have. Just remember to occasionally let the players win. Finally, the best part, traps. Now this is what kobolds are known for, but try not to overdo it. Traps are hard to make entertaining, and in fact, I think I'll make my next video about how to run traps effectively as a DM. Kobolds use traps both offensively and defensively, so when ambushing a party, kobolds should already have traps laid out. Kobold packs tend to carry several bear traps, and they know how to hide them. But the real fun is when you get to let out your inner Rambo.
I could have killed them all. I could have killed you. Been telling you the law. Out here, it's me. Don't push it. Don't push it, I'll give you a war you won't believe.
Remember in First Blood how Rambo made some traps just using a giant Bowie knife? Do the same thing. Google survival hunting traps, and you'll find tons of inspiration for this. Just go wild. If you have a high magic setting, then who's to say kobolds don't have an enchanter going around carving dangerous magic runes wherever they feel like it? The important thing to remember here is that mechanically, these traps are just meant to give you a few extra attacks during an encounter. Players can carve through a group of kobolds quicker than you think, so traps will give you that little bit extra to soften them up before the carnage really begins. Never underestimate how much damage PCs are capable of dealing out. The other way kobolds use traps is to protect their lairs. These are the traps that rogues get to interact with, and where older edition rogues really shine. Modern day rogues are capable of dealing traps, but they also tend to be a lot more combat focused and less of a skill monkey, but I'm starting to get off topic. Kobolds rarely dig out high ceilings in their lairs, and if they do, it is specifically so that they can put a tripwire at head level height for an adventurer. This way, kobolds can pass right under the wire, but a human-sized intruder probably won't see the trap in the dark. Kobolds also love using thin wooden planks as bridges across pits. A lightweight kobold won't have any trouble, but that half-orc and plate mail, well, that's a different story. It should be incredibly difficult to attack kobolds on their home turf. When kobolds settle in, they settle in for good. Kobolds are constantly digging and mining and making their lairs a complex network of tunnels with multiple passages to and from any room. And some of these tunnels are littered with traps but are unused by the kobolds. They're just waiting for a bold but foolish adventurer to come wandering through. Since the majority of their tunnels are only about 4 foot tall and about half as wide, it's plenty of space for a kobold, but a nightmare for your adventuring party. Being hired to clear out a lair of kobolds should be the hardest contract your party will ever have to take.
Son of a bitch is dug in like an Alabama tick.
A big part of making players remember a lair is the flavor you put into it. With kobolds specifically, I like to go for the claustrophobia and the gross out angles. Claustrophobia is an easy one for kobolds. Kobolds don't need light, so unless players have a light source, they can't see their own hands in front of their faces. Remind them of this constantly. Also, throw in some tunnels that require the characters to literally belly crawl to move forward in a tunnel so narrow they can't even move their arms. This can create some fun tension, despite being an easy obstacle for your players. About halfway through the tunnel, I would ask for the entire party to give me dexterity saving throws, or they'll be wedged under the earth forever. And I would never actually let the player fail the throw, because that would completely grind the story to a halt. but the players don't know that. If the player rolls low, then I would then ask for a wisdom saving throw to try and fight back the panic from realizing they are literally in an 8-inch opening with 100 tons of rock and dirt above their heads. If they pass that save, then I tell them that keeping calm has helped them to realize that twisting their hips in a different way has enabled them to keep moving forward. And if the player failed that wisdom saving throw, then I'd say that in their panic they forcibly push through the tunnel, tearing up their arms and legs on the sharp rocks, taking maybe 1d4 of damage. Little things like this can help build the tension and show the players how out of their element they really are. Along with the cramped conditions, you can really push the gross out factor. Kobolds are not clean creatures. They don't have sewers or landfills. Sanitation in a cave would be horrible. The stench would be literally overpowering. I also like to consider a food source when I design a lair because I tend to go way overboard on minute details. So my kobolds always breed rats by the hundreds, keeping the rodents in smooth-walled pits in the ground. Kobolds always keep these pits in defensible locations, usually near the entrances of their home. I like to imagine that when a kobold goes out, he just pokes a spear in the pit and grabs a bit of food for the road. The reasoning behind this, aside from keeping a stable and easily maintained source of food, thematically, is that when the lair is attacked, kobolds will try to push attackers into these pits. This defense tactic also has the added benefit of providing food for their rodent livestock. But really, this is just a fun way to freak out low-level players. No one wants to hear that their character is literally being eaten alive by rats. I also like to add in a poison maker's room in kobold lairs that I design. I like to imagine that kobolds would keep baskets and baskets of scorpions and snakes and spiders, and they would farm their venom. There would also be plenty of clay jars and bowls full of venom ready to be put on blazing weaponry, and the players can use this too. It adds a lot of flavor for your kobolds, but it also gives players a chance to vent their frustration by forcing the kobolds to fight against their own tactics. It's always good to remind ourselves that while we are here to challenge the players, our first priority is making sure the players have fun, and there's nothing wrong with giving your players a temporary power boost every now and then. But if you want to crank the gross out factor up to 10, then the poison maker's room should also be the sewage room. Many historical warriors would cover their arrowheads in a mixture of human and animal waste to ensure that the enemy's wounds would become infected. While all of this is incredibly gross, it adds an element that your players likely won't forget. And the goal is to have your players figuratively and sometimes literally dying to get out of this filthy hole as soon as possible. To sum it all up, don't use kobolds as a random encounter. To be played correctly, you really need to put some prep into them. Be sure to really play up the theme: traps, poison, smoke, claustrophobia. All of these things are a pain to deal with and will leave lasting memories. Mechanically speaking, kobolds are going to be a speed bump in most players' careers. So you really need to amp up the flavor to make them seem deadlier than they really are. The reason kobolds are such great monsters is because they allow you as a DM to really flex your creative and tactical muscles. If you pull it off, you'll keep your players on their heels without their lives truly being threatened, which is very important at low levels. 5th edition especially is known for lots of fatalities at low levels, and it's our job to make sure the players reach the higher levels, but the players need to feel like they've earned it. This video really has become a bit of a monster on its own right. I really could talk about kobolds for days, but I'll wrap it up here. I'd like to keep making more videos about monster tactics, but I need your feedback on what you would like to see in the future. If you have any questions about kobolds or have suggestions on future videos, please leave a comment down below. If you found this video useful or inspiring, please hit the thumbs up button. And if you weren't a fan, hit the thumbs down button, and again, leave a comment telling me what I could do to improve future videos. Your feedback is incredibly important for me as I try to figure out what kind of content people want to see and where this channel should head in the future. If you enjoyed this video, next week I'll probably do that video on traps. Look for it on Monday. If you want a notification when it's uploaded, go ahead and sub to my channel down below. Thanks for joining me, and until next time, I'm Steven the DM.